The millionaire CEO walked into his office expecting another ordinary day, until he found two sleeping blonde toddlers in his chair, and a note that would change everything. Jason Miller's mornings always started the same way, early, quiet, efficient. He liked to arrive at the office before the rest of the world stirred, when the city was still heavy with morning fog and the building was empty enough to echo. It gave him a sense of control, the illusion of being one step ahead of everything. His tailored coat, dark tie, and polished shoes were all part of the image he wore like armor. Jason wasn't just a CEO, he was the foundation of an empire he had built with precision and discipline. Emotions, unpredictability, those were things he had trained himself to avoid. That's why, on that particular morning, he was entirely unprepared for what he found behind the heavy glass door of his office. He stepped inside, already loosening his coat and pulling his phone from his pocket, intent on reviewing the day's agenda. But he froze mid-step. His office wasn't empty. In the center of the room, curled up in his leather executive chair, were two small boys. They couldn't have been older than 4. Their heads rested against each other's shoulders as they slept soundly, golden hair tousled, cheeks pink with warmth. They were wearing simple clothes, sweatshirts, jeans, small sneakers dangling just above the floor. A soft backpack lay near the base of the desk, zipped neatly, as if someone had taken time to prepare it. Jason stared at them in disbelief, his mind scrambling for logic. Was this a mistake? A prank? A security failure? But as he took a slow step forward and looked more closely at their faces, something in his chest shifted. Their hair was lighter than his, but the shape of their features, the lines of their jaws, the curve of their brows, and most of all, the unmistakable blue of their eyes, stopped him cold. They had his eyes. Not similar. Identical. He didn't move, afraid to wake them, afraid of what it would mean if this moment was real. 1,000 questions filled his mind, loud and clashing. Who were they? How had they gotten in? Why were they in his chair, in his office, alone? The door behind him opened sharply, and his assistant stepped in, out of breath. She froze when she saw the scene, then rushed forward with wide eyes and a stack of papers nearly slipping from her hands. Mr. Miller, I'm so sorry. Security found them downstairs this morning. They were on the lobby couch. There was no adult. Just this. She handed him a folded note. Jason took it slowly. The paper was cheap and lined, the handwriting uneven but readable. Asterisk, take care of them. They have no one else but you. Asterisk, there was no name, no explanation, no contact information. His hands trembled slightly as he read it again. The boys shifted in their sleep but didn't wake. One turned his face just enough for Jason to see the exact tilt of a jawline that could have been his own at that age. His assistant waited, clearly unsure whether to speak or leave, but Jason couldn't answer. He couldn't think. He just stood there, with the weight of a lifetime of silence suddenly sitting in his office chair, breathing quietly in two tiny bodies. His voice, when it came, was hoarse and quiet. Don't touch them, he said. Don't call anyone. Not yet. She hesitated, nodded once, and stepped back. Jason lowered himself into the chair across from them, the one he used during interviews and board meetings, and for the first time in years, he felt like a man who had no idea what came next. Jason sat in silence, barely aware of the ticking clock on the wall or the soft footsteps echoing through the corridor outside his office. All of his carefully laid plans for the day, meetings, reports, investor calls, blurred into irrelevance as he watched the two boys continue to sleep peacefully in his chair. They looked so comfortable, as if they belonged there, as if this office, this cold space filled with polished surfaces and structured routine, had somehow become a shelter. The light from the windows cast a pale glow across their small faces, highlighting their soft features and the undeniable resemblance to him. It wasn't just in their eyes. It was in their expressions, the way their brows furrowed slightly even in sleep, the curve of their mouths, the same subtle tilt of the chin that he saw in the mirror every morning. He didn't know how long he stared before the taller of the two stirred. The boy blinked up at him with confusion, then sat up, gently nudging his brother awake. Neither of them looked frightened, only a little unsure. Jason opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? "Hi, I'm the stranger whose chair you're in. The father you never met." The boys looked at him, their eyes flicking between him and the note now resting on his desk. Jason forced himself to smile, though it felt foreign. "Hey," he said quietly. "I'm Jason." The boys didn't respond immediately. The smaller one, with a faint scar above his eyebrow, held the other's hand tightly. That simple gesture hit Jason harder than anything else. They were holding on to each other in a room full of unfamiliar things, as if they knew they were all the other had. He stood and moved slowly, crouching down in front of them, trying not to tower or intimidate. "Are you okay? Are you hungry? Thirsty?" The smaller one nodded. The other stayed quiet, still watching him carefully, measuring him. Jason stood again and called his assistant. "Get them something to eat. Real food. Not from the vending machine." She nodded quickly and disappeared. Jason returned to his chair, the one across from them, and sat down, trying to appear calm. "Do you know who I am?" he asked gently. The smaller boy nodded again. "You're Jason Miller," he said softly. "Our mom said that's your name." Jason's breath caught. It was surreal to hear it spoken out loud. "What's your mom's name?" he asked, though in his heart he already knew. The boys exchanged a glance, then the older one finally spoke. "Emily. Emily Carter." It felt like time collapsed. Emily. A name he hadn't spoken in years. A woman whose departure had felt sudden but not significant at the time. A brief relationship, unplanned and unremarkable, or so he had told himself. He hadn't even known she was pregnant. And now here were these boys, his sons. And she had sent them to him. Or left them, he didn't yet know which. He sat in stunned silence as food arrived, and the boys began to eat quietly at the small round meeting table. They were polite, gentle, like they'd been taught not to make trouble. He couldn't stop watching them, couldn't stop thinking about all the years that had passed without him knowing they existed. The missed birthdays, the first steps, the scraped knees he hadn't been there to soothe. After they finished, one of them asked softly, "Are we going back now?" Jason swallowed hard. "Back where?" The boy shrugged. "Home. With Mommy." Jason's voice failed him for a moment. "Do you know where she is?" Another pause. "She said if anything ever happened, we should come here. That you'd find us." It was too much. Too sudden. Too deep. He stood slowly, walked to the window, stared out at the city he thought he knew so well. And for the first time in a very long time, Jason Miller felt completely lost. Jason spent the rest of the day in a daze, walking through the motions of his executive role while his mind remained trapped in that quiet office with the two little boys who carried his eyes. His assistant had moved them temporarily to the lounge area just outside his suite, where they now sat with coloring books and juice boxes, under the watchful eyes of two junior staff members who had no idea how to explain what was happening. Jason didn't either. He cancelled all his meetings with a few clipped words, ignoring the confusion and whispers that rippled through the upper floors of the company. No one dared to question him directly, but the sight of two young children sitting quietly in the CEO's private space did not go unnoticed. Jason didn't care. His entire world had shifted, and the weight of it pressed heavily on every breath he took. By the time evening crept in and the building emptied out, he had already made 2 calls, one to a private investigator he trusted implicitly, and one to his lawyer. He didn't bother to explain everything, just enough. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The children were clearly his, of that he had no doubt, but the circumstances of how and why they had ended up in his office were still wrapped in silence. He needed to find Emily. He needed to know what had happened to her, and what kind of life she and the boys had been living while he built his empire in blissful ignorance. As he sat alone in his darkened office, he reviewed the last time he had seen Emily. She had worked in public relations, a quiet but competent presence in meetings. They had been involved for only a few months, a period he remembered with little clarity. He had been focused on expansion, distracted by the pursuit of a merger that demanded everything from him. She had resigned unexpectedly, leaving behind only a brief letter thanking him for the opportunity. He hadn't thought much of it then. There had been no confrontation, no goodbye. And now, 5 years later, 2 living pieces of her had arrived at his doorstep, waiting for answers he didn't have. The investigator called just after 9 p.m. Her voice was calm, but her words were anything but. Emily Carter had been involved in a car accident nearly 3 months ago. She was alive, but barely. She was in a long-term care facility in the city, in a coma since the night of the crash. No known family, no emergency contacts. She had listed a guardian in case of emergency, Jason Miller. His own name. That one detail struck him harder than all the others combined. She had trusted him. After all this time, after his silence, she had still trusted that if something happened, he would come for them. He left the office immediately. The building was mostly dark, but the boys were still waiting near the front reception desk, bundled in borrowed jackets and holding hands like they were one person split in two. They looked up at him, not with fear, but with that same strange mixture of familiarity and hope that continued to unravel him from the inside out. "We're going," he said gently, crouching down to meet their eyes. "To see your mom." They didn't ask questions. They only stood up and followed him, their small feet echoing in the marble lobby. Jason had never been so uncertain in his life. But he knew one thing with complete clarity: he would not leave these boys again. No matter what waited behind the hospital doors, he was walking through them. And this time, he wouldn't walk away. The ride to the hospital was quiet, the kind of silence that weighed more heavily than any words. The twins sat in the back seat, buckled in side by side, their faces pressed to the windows, watching the lights of the city flicker past. Jason kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror, trying to see something beyond their identical features, some expression or flicker that might give him a sense of what they were feeling, but they remained unreadable. He felt an unfamiliar pressure in his chest, something close to fear, though not the kind he was used to. This wasn't about losing control of a business or a deal. This was about walking into a past he had chosen to forget, and into a future he had never prepared for. The long-term care facility sat quietly off a side street, tucked between 2 office buildings and wrapped in cold, white light. The parking lot was mostly empty when they arrived, and the air outside was colder than he expected. He helped the boys out of the car, guiding them gently by the shoulders, not because they needed help walking, but because he needed to feel like he was doing something. They held hands again as they entered, a small unit of trust he hadn't yet earned but had somehow been granted access to. Inside, the nurse at the front desk recognized Emily's name immediately. Jason gave his own without thinking, and her face changed just slightly when she found him listed as emergency contact. No questions were asked, only a quiet nod and a gesture toward the elevator. The boys walked beside him silently, their shoes squeaking faintly against the tile floor. Jason's heart pounded harder the closer they got to her room. Part of him still couldn't believe this was real, that just hours ago he had been reviewing numbers and sending emails, living a life that now felt like someone else's. When they stepped into the room, time seemed to slow. Emily lay still in a narrow bed, surrounded by quiet machines that beeped in steady intervals. Her skin was pale, her hair tucked behind her ears by someone who had taken the time to keep her looking cared for. There were no flowers, no photos, no signs that anyone had visited. Until now. The boys didn't speak. They moved to her side naturally, as if they had done it 1,000 times. One of them climbed carefully onto the chair beside her bed, reaching for her hand without hesitation. Jason stood frozen near the door, unable to move, watching them as if from a distance. He had no idea what he expected. Maybe anger. Maybe grief. But what he saw was something else entirely: acceptance. He finally stepped forward, slowly, until he was at the foot of her bed. His eyes scanned her face, trying to remember the woman she had been when they met. Back then, she was quiet but smart, always a step ahead in meetings, with a sharp wit she only used when necessary. He remembered the way she had smiled once when he complimented her on a report, the way she used to wear her hair pulled into a loose braid when she stayed late. He didn't remember ever seeing her scared. But now she looked fragile, like someone suspended between this world and the next, and he couldn't stop thinking about how she must have felt, alone, with no one to call but him. A nurse stepped in and checked the monitors. Jason pulled her aside quietly, asking for details. The prognosis was uncertain. She had suffered a traumatic brain injury. She was stable, but unresponsive. Some patients recovered. Some didn't. No one could say which she would be. He returned to the boys, who hadn't left her side. One of them looked up at him and whispered, "Is Mommy going to wake up?" The question was a dagger. Jason knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We don't know yet," he said honestly. "But we're here now. She's not alone anymore." They stayed there for hours, until the boys began to fall asleep curled up beside her, their small bodies breathing in sync with the rhythm of the machines. Jason didn't leave. He sat in the chair in the corner of the room, watching them all, and felt the full weight of what had been given to him, the responsibility, the guilt, and the fragile, unfinished gift of being allowed back into their lives. He didn't deserve it. But he would not waste it. That night, for the first time in years, Jason Miller did not think about business, or the market, or his schedule for the next day. He thought only about her, about them, and about the long road ahead. And he silently promised himself he would walk every step of it. The days that followed became a blur of new routines and quiet realizations. Jason took time off from work for the first time in over a decade, something that stunned his staff and unsettled his board of directors. He gave them no explanation other than a vague family emergency and trusted his most senior advisor to hold things together while he stepped back. He didn't care what it looked like. The life he had built, polished, efficient, all-consuming, suddenly felt far away and hollow compared to the reality of two 4-year-old boys who needed more than just a name on a birth certificate. He moved the twins into his penthouse temporarily, though he quickly realized how unfit the space was for children. Everything was made of glass and steel, sharp-edged and expensive, and completely devoid of warmth. He cleared out his home office to make room for 2 small beds, bought toys he didn't understand, and stood helpless in the supermarket aisle wondering which cereal to choose. He didn't know their routines, their favorite colors, what scared them at night or made them laugh uncontrollably. He didn't know what they'd been through with Emily, how she had raised them, what she had told them about him, if anything at all. But they didn't act angry. They didn't demand answers. They simply watched him closely, as if waiting to see who he would become now that he had them in his care. Mornings were clumsy. Jason burned toast more often than not, spilled juice on marble counters, and gave up trying to tie their shoelaces properly without their help. The boys were patient with him in the way only young children could be, curious, observant, quietly hopeful. He started reading bedtime stories, stumbling over silly voices that made them giggle under the blankets. He learned they liked dinosaur books, that one of them, Liam, hated bananas, and the other, Lucas, liked to line up his toy cars in perfect rows before bed. He watched them draw pictures of themselves with a man they started calling Dad without hesitation, and every time he heard that word, it shook something loose inside him. Each evening, they visited the hospital. The twins brought new drawings for Emily, telling her about their day, even though she couldn't answer. Jason watched them sit by her bed, talking to her as if she was just asleep, as if she'd wake any moment and ask them to tell it all again. Sometimes he stayed in the corner and said nothing. Other times, he sat beside them and whispered apologies to the woman who had once trusted him enough to carry this burden alone. The guilt never left him. It sat quietly in the background of every smile, every laugh, every bedtime prayer. One afternoon, after the boys had gone home with his assistant for the night, Jason remained at the hospital longer than usual. He took a seat next to Emily's bed and looked at her face, pale but peaceful, her hand resting lightly under the blanket. He remembered how strong she had been, how she had never asked him for anything even when he pulled away from the relationship. Back then, she must have already known she was pregnant. And still, she left without a word, choosing not to fight a battle he wasn't ready for. And now, she had sent their sons to him with nothing but a note, believing that he would find his way to them, somehow. He spoke softly, more to himself than to her. He told her about their days, how Liam liked superhero socks and Lucas hated bedtime, how both boys had memorized the security code to the building and insisted on punching it in themselves. He told her how they missed her, and how unprepared he felt, how terrified he was of failing them again. And then, after a long pause, he said what had been building in him since that first morning in his office. "I never wanted to be a father because I was afraid I'd be like mine, absent, distracted, more committed to work than to life. I thought staying away would save them from that. But I was wrong. All they needed was someone who stayed. And I'm staying, Em. I'm not going anywhere now." There was no response. Only the hum of machines and the sound of distant voices in the hallway. But in that quiet room, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden movement, no miracle awakening. Just a deep, unfamiliar stillness inside him that finally felt like peace. And for Jason Miller, who had lived his whole life outrunning anything that asked too much of his heart, that was everything. Winter crept in slowly, casting a gray chill across the city and frosting the tall windows of Jason's penthouse with delicate patterns of ice. The twins had begun to settle into their new routines, and Jason, to his own astonishment, was settling into fatherhood. Each day brought new discoveries, not only about the boys, Liam's quiet stubbornness, Lucas's habit of humming when he focused, their shared fascination with building blocks and anything sweet, but also about himself. He had thought parenting would be about structure and control, things he understood well, but instead it was about flexibility, mess, and listening closely even when words weren't being said. He found himself changing in ways he couldn't have predicted. He now kept his phone on silent for hours at a time and had learned to ignore emails while helping Liam find a missing sock or trying to untangle Lucas's small fingers from a tub of spilled paint. His apartment had transformed from a minimalist showroom into a space that actually looked lived in. Toys cluttered the corners, drawings decorated the fridge, and the once pristine marble countertops were now smudged with flour and fingerprints more often than not. And yet, Jason didn't mind. In fact, he found himself oddly comforted by the chaos, as though it proved something he had never dared to hope for, that he belonged to something real. They continued visiting Emily every evening, and though her condition remained unchanged, the routine became sacred. The boys would carry in their stories from the day, their crayon pictures folded carefully in their jacket pockets, and place them on the table beside her bed. They would take turns holding her hand, telling her about breakfast disasters or what they had learned at preschool. Jason would sit nearby, watching them with a quiet ache in his chest, always wondering if she could hear them, always wishing she would open her eyes and see what had become of the world she left behind. One snowy afternoon, as the boys napped on the couch after an impromptu pillow fort session, Jason sat at the kitchen table staring at an email from his company's board of directors. They were asking for a decision. His temporary leave was nearing its end, and they needed to know if he was returning, or stepping down. For a long time, he had assumed he would go back. It was his company. His identity. But as he sat in that kitchen, surrounded by evidence of a life far messier and more meaningful than the one he'd left behind, he realized he no longer wanted to lead the world from a corner office. He didn't want to be a man driven by spreadsheets and empty victories. That night, after the boys had gone to sleep and the apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater, Jason pulled out his laptop and drafted a letter of resignation. It wasn't bitter or dramatic. It was simple. Honest. He thanked the board for their trust and acknowledged the work they had done together, but he ended it with a truth he had finally accepted, that his legacy was not in numbers or public recognition, but in the small voices that now called him Daddy. The next morning, Jason made pancakes from scratch, burned the first batch, and laughed when the boys asked if they could help fix it. He handed them each a spoon and let them stir the batter, flour dusting the air and landing in their hair, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Later, as they walked through the snow toward the hospital once again, Lucas slipped his hand into Jason's without looking up, and Jason squeezed it gently, the cold forgotten in the warmth of that simple connection. They entered the hospital just as they always did, greeted the familiar nurses, and stepped into the room that had slowly become a second home. But this time, something was different. Jason couldn't say what at first, it was just a stillness, a sense of something quietly shifting in the air. The machines beeped their steady rhythm, the lights cast their usual soft glow, but Emily's fingers twitched as Liam placed a drawing in her hand. Just once. Barely visible. But it was enough. Jason leaned in closer, calling her name softly, and for a breathless moment, he saw it, her eyelids fluttered. Only for a second. But this time, the hope wasn't imagined. He looked at his sons, who stared at their mother with wide eyes, and he realized that no matter what happened next, everything had already changed. Not because life had gone back to what it once was, but because they had built something new. And now, perhaps, it was her turn to come home to it. The week that followed was a cautious walk between hope and fear. Emily's momentary movement, the subtle twitch of her fingers, the flicker of her eyelids, had left the doctors intrigued but careful in their assessments. Jason didn't allow himself to celebrate too early, but inside, something in him had already begun to stir. That moment had cracked open the solid wall of uncertainty that had defined the past months. The boys, however, didn't hesitate. They believed, fully and without doubt, that their mother was coming back. Every day, they brought more drawings, sang softly to her, and told her long stories with the faith only children could carry unshaken. Jason found himself watching Emily more closely. He noticed details he'd never paid attention to before, the faint freckles near her temple, the curve of her fingers, the quiet strength still visible in her body despite the stillness. He talked to her often, not only about the boys, but about memories he had buried or ignored. He told her about the first time he'd seen her in that boardroom, about how he had admired her confidence, even though he hadn't known what to do with it. He told her about the fear that had driven him away when things got serious, and the regret that never left him once he learned the truth. There was no one else to hear him in that room, no judgment, only the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could hear him now. The boys had become part of the hospital's rhythm. Nurses greeted them by name, slipping them extra cookies or showing them pictures from the break room bulletin board. Doctors smiled when they came down the hall, whispering updates to Jason when the twins were distracted with picture books or puzzles in the waiting area. Each day brought small signs. Emily's hands began to move more. Her eyelids twitched more regularly. One afternoon, when Jason was adjusting her blanket, her lips parted slightly, and he could have sworn he heard a whisper. It was not a word, not yet, but it was real. The boys didn't need proof, they already believed. But Jason finally began to as well. At home, life continued with its strange, beautiful chaos. The twins had begun calling Jason Daddy without hesitation, and he no longer flinched when they said it. He had learned to pack lunches with notes inside, to braid plastic dinosaurs into hairlines, to handle tantrums about bedtime socks and share endless retellings of a cartoon character named Rocket Dog. They were his now, in a way that wasn't about biology or legal papers, but about presence, about choice. Every scraped knee and whispered goodnight made that bond stronger. One evening, as snow fell lightly outside and the twins played in the living room under a fortress of pillows, Jason found himself standing at the edge of it all, just watching. There was a lightness in the room that he couldn't remember ever feeling in his life. Not in boardrooms, not at charity galas or launch events. It was something quieter, more complete. When Lucas peeked out and shouted, "Daddy! Come be the dragon!" Jason laughed and crawled in without hesitation, letting himself be covered in blankets and shrieks of delight. He wasn't pretending anymore. This was real. Later that night, after they had fallen asleep in a heap of blankets on the floor, Jason sat beside them and let the quiet wrap around him. He thought of Emily, of the day she had left the company, and wondered what it must have been like for her to walk away from him, knowing what she carried inside. He wished he had asked. He wished he had listened. But most of all, he was grateful she had trusted him in the end, even when he hadn't earned it. He hoped she would wake soon, not because he needed her forgiveness, but because he wanted her to see what had grown in her absence. The next morning, they walked into the hospital room as usual, arms full of drawings and stuffed animals. But something had changed. The room was warmer. Brighter. And when Jason stepped in, he froze. Emily's eyes were open. She was looking at him. At the boys. Not confused, not afraid, just tired and clear and alive. Liam gasped. Lucas dropped his picture. Jason crossed the room in 3 steps and sank beside her, reaching for her hand. She smiled, barely, her lips cracked and dry, and when she spoke, her voice was little more than a breath. "You kept them safe." He nodded, unable to speak. The boys clung to him, wide-eyed and frozen in wonder. She looked at all 3 of them, and then her gaze returned to Jason. "You came back." And in that moment, the future opened like sunlight through snow-covered branches, fragile, bright, and full of life. Recovery was slow, but steady. After waking, Emily spent several days barely speaking, drifting in and out of sleep as her body adjusted to awareness again. The doctors were optimistic but measured, reminding Jason that even though she had returned to consciousness, her body and mind had been through immense trauma. The boys, however, didn't need those warnings. They were simply happy. They visited every day with renewed energy, bringing books and stories, and sometimes just curling up next to her bed, content to be near her now that her eyes followed their movements and her hands squeezed back when they held them. It didn't matter that she couldn't talk much or stay awake long. She was there. That was enough. Jason stayed close. He managed every detail of her care, brought her clothes, cleaned her room when nurses were busy, and spoke to every specialist himself. He was no longer just an observer in the hospital, he was her partner, and the staff began to treat him as such. He kept a notebook where he tracked her medications, her vitals, and every tiny milestone, the day she sat up by herself, the first time she asked for water, the first time she whispered the boys' names. The more she returned, the more the weight in his chest lifted, but it was replaced by something just as heavy, responsibility. He wasn't just holding a space for her return anymore. He was building the life she would come back to. Emily moved to a rehabilitation facility 2 weeks after waking, and Jason and the boys visited daily. The twins became little fixtures in the halls, waving at nurses and helping push her wheelchair when she was too tired to walk. Jason brought meals from home, helped with her physical therapy stretches when allowed, and sat beside her for hours, telling her everything he hadn't before. He didn't avoid the hard things. He told her the truth, about how selfish he had been, how blind, how afraid. She listened. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she was silent, and sometimes she simply took his hand and let it stay there. Forgiveness, he learned, wasn't a single moment. It was something built over time, in glances and quiet reassurances and in the act of not leaving when things got difficult. By spring, Emily was strong enough to return home. But this time, she didn't go back to the apartment she had once lived in alone. She came to Jason's home, one now filled with drawings, laughter, chipped mugs, forgotten socks, and the unmistakable echo of children growing up. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. She walked through the door slowly, her sons rushing to hug her, Jason waiting quietly behind them. She looked around and smiled at the changes. Her life, once paused in a sterile hospital room, had continued in ways she never imagined. They moved forward together, not as people trying to fix the past, but as a family choosing to honor what had survived it. Jason adjusted to this new life with gratitude he didn't always know how to express. He learned to be present not just in big moments, but in the small ones, the way the boys waited for him at the school gate, the way Emily laughed when she forgot the grocery list, the way silence felt comforting now instead of cold. One Sunday afternoon, as they all sat on a picnic blanket in the park, Emily resting against him, the boys chasing butterflies nearby, Jason looked at them and felt something he had never truly allowed before: peace. Not because everything was fixed, not because guilt was gone, but because he had chosen a different kind of success. One not built in boardrooms or measured in profit, but shaped by the steady rhythm of everyday love. As the sun dipped lower and the boys ran back with grass-stained knees and tangled hair, Jason pulled them into his arms and kissed their foreheads. Emily leaned into his shoulder, her voice soft against his ear. "You found your way." And Jason, looking at his sons, his partner, and the life he had almost missed, whispered back, "Thanks to all of you." They stayed there as the sky turned gold, not needing anything more than what they already had. And for the first time, Jason didn't think about what came next. He simply breathed it in. What I love most about the ending of this story is its quiet strength. It doesn't rely on dramatic twists or perfect resolutions, but instead finds its power in emotional honesty and earned connection. Jason's transformation isn't sudden, it's slow, sometimes messy, and deeply human. Watching a man so rooted in control and isolation grow into someone who embraces love, presence, and vulnerability feels incredibly rewarding. The story reminds us that redemption doesn't come from grand gestures, but from consistent effort, humility, and the courage to stay when it matters most. The final image, a family healed not by erasing pain, but by choosing to build something new despite it, is the kind of ending that lingers long after the last line. Leo Kingston had spent his life closing deals, crushing competitors, and controlling every outcome. But none of his billions, none of his power, had prepared him for the moment a 6-year-old girl with dark curls and striking blue eyes tugged at his sleeve by the pool of his luxury hotel and whispered, "Please, mister, help me. My mom won't wake up." At first, he thought she had mistaken him for someone else. But as he followed her through the marble hallways, past the indulgent guests who had no idea their world was about to shift, Leo felt something unsettling crawl up his spine. And when he stepped into that dimly lit hotel room and saw the unconscious woman on the bed, his entire past came rushing back. Because he knew her. And the little girl clutching a battered stuffed rabbit? She had his eyes. Leo Kingston sat by the infinity pool of the exclusive hotel, his dark hair slightly tousled by the warm Monaco breeze. His glass of whiskey rested on the small side table next to him, untouched. The world around him was perfect: crystal clear water, waiters in crisp uniforms, and the quiet murmur of wealthy guests enjoying their private retreats. He had everything a man could ever want, yet an unfamiliar emptiness sat deep within his chest. He had spent years building his empire, turning his sharp instincts into a billion-dollar investment firm that controlled markets and toppled competitors. But success had come at a price. He had no real attachments, no family waiting for him anywhere, no one to share his achievements with. Relationships, when they happened, were transactional at best. His entire life was about control, of his business, his time, and his emotions. But for the first time in years, sitting under the golden afternoon sun, he felt like he had lost control of something, though he couldn't name what. As he exhaled slowly, letting his gaze drift over the edge of the pool, a small shadow moved in the corner of his vision. He turned his head slightly, expecting to see a waiter or perhaps one of the hotel staff, but instead, a little girl stood a few feet away from him. She had dark, curly hair that framed her delicate face, and her enormous blue eyes locked onto his with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. There was fear there, but also determination. In her small hands, she clutched a worn-out stuffed rabbit, its fur faded from years of love. Leo frowned. Children weren't common in places like this, not without their wealthy parents hovering nearby. He scanned the area, expecting to see a nanny or a distracted mother on the phone, but the girl was alone. Something about her was strangely familiar, but he couldn't place it. Before he could say anything, she stepped closer, her little fingers tightening around the rabbit. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. "Sir, please, help me." Leo sat up, his instincts immediately sharpening. He wasn't the kind of man who got involved in other people's problems, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made it impossible to ignore. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice steady but softer than usual. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the hotel. "My mom, she won't wake up." For a moment, Leo didn't move. The words sank in, and a strange sensation gripped him, something between dread and protectiveness. He had dealt with high-stakes negotiations, ruthless corporate takeovers, and financial crises that made others crumble. But a little girl asking for help in a desperate whisper. That was entirely foreign to him. He stood up without thinking, already moving before his mind could question why. "Where is she?" The girl turned quickly and began to run toward the hotel. Leo followed without hesitation. Leo followed the little girl through the hotel's grand hallway, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor as she hurried ahead, gripping her stuffed rabbit tightly. The guests around them barely took notice, sipping their champagne or lounging in luxury, oblivious to the urgency of the moment. The girl glanced over her shoulder once to make sure he was still there, then continued running down the corridor. Her small frame moved with surprising determination, as if she knew she had no time to waste. They reached an elevator, but instead of waiting, she turned and ran toward the stairs. Leo hesitated for only a second before following. She was moving quickly for someone with such short legs, her bare feet barely making a sound against the cool marble steps. He was used to moving fast, to making decisions in seconds that changed the course of industries, but there was something unnerving about following a frightened child up the winding staircase, unsure of what he was about to walk into. By the time they reached the third floor, she was slightly out of breath, but she didn't slow down. She ran straight to the end of the hallway, stopping in front of a door marked 312. The door was slightly ajar. Leo reached her just as she hesitated on the threshold, pressing her small body against the doorframe. She turned her head and looked up at him, her blue eyes wide with worry. For the first time, her confidence wavered. She clutched her rabbit closer and whispered, "She's inside." Leo gently pushed the door open, stepping into the dimly lit hotel room. The heavy curtains were drawn, casting long shadows across the bed. The air inside was thick, carrying the scent of salt from the nearby ocean mixed with something faintly medicinal. A bedside lamp was still on, its weak glow illuminating the still figure lying on the mattress. A young woman lay motionless on the bed, her dark hair fanned out against the pillow, her breathing barely visible. Her skin was pale, and the rise and fall of her chest was so faint that, for a terrible moment, Leo thought she might already be gone. He stepped closer, his sharp gaze scanning the scene. On the nightstand beside the bed, an open bottle of pills lay on its side, some of the tablets spilled onto the glass surface. His stomach tightened as realization struck him. He knelt beside the bed and carefully touched the woman's wrist, searching for a pulse. The beat was weak but still there. He exhaled, feeling an unexpected wave of relief. "She's alive," he said, more to himself than to the girl. The child had crept up beside him, staring at the woman with wide, unblinking eyes. She knelt on the floor next to the bed, placing her rabbit beside her mother's hand as if the toy could somehow bring her back. Leo pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. The call connected immediately, and he relayed the situation with his usual efficiency, giving the room number and explaining what he suspected, an overdose. The operator assured him an ambulance would arrive within minutes. As he ended the call, he turned to the girl, who had not moved from her spot. She was still staring at her mother, her tiny fingers wrapped around the woman's limp hand. "What's your name?" Leo asked gently. "Sophie," she murmured without looking at him. He glanced at the woman on the bed. He had no idea who she was or how she had ended up like this. But there was one thing he did know: Sophie had come to him for help. And for reasons he couldn't yet understand, he wasn't going to walk away. The paramedics arrived quickly, their movements efficient and precise as they assessed the unconscious woman on the bed. Leo stepped back, watching as they checked her vitals, inserted N4, and prepared her for transport. Sophie didn't move from her spot beside the bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit so tightly that her knuckles turned white. One of the paramedics, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, crouched down to Sophie's level. "Sweetheart, we're going to take your mom to the hospital so the doctors can help her, okay?" she said softly. Sophie didn't respond, just nodded once, her grip on the rabbit tightening. The paramedic glanced up at Leo, silently asking if he was with the girl. "I'll take her," Leo said without hesitation, though the words surprised even him. Sophie looked up at him for the first time since the paramedics arrived. Her blue eyes were full of uncertainty, as if she wasn't sure she could trust him yet. But something in her gaze told him she wanted to. The medics lifted her mother onto the stretcher, securing the straps before wheeling her out of the room. Leo followed, placing a steadying hand on Sophie's shoulder as they moved through the hallway, past the curious stares of hotel guests who had emerged from their rooms. By the time they reached the ambulance, Sophie hesitated, looking between the paramedics and Leo. "Can I go with her?" she asked, her voice small. The paramedic hesitated. "We usually only allow immediate family in the ambulance, sweetheart." Leo stepped forward. "She's just a child," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "She needs to be with her mother." The paramedic looked between him and Sophie, then sighed. "All right, she can ride up front." Leo watched as they helped Sophie into the passenger seat. He had no idea why he was still standing there, why he hadn't simply turned and walked away once the emergency was under control. But as the ambulance doors shut and the siren blared to life, he knew there was no way he was leaving this unfinished. He pulled out his phone, called his driver, and within minutes, his black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. He slid into the back seat and gave the driver the name of the hospital. As they drove, he found himself staring out the window, his mind racing. Something about this girl unsettled him. It wasn't just the situation, it was her. The way she had looked at him by the pool, the way she had chosen him to ask for help when there were dozens of other people around. And those eyes. They reminded him of something, or someone, but he couldn't quite place it. 15 minutes later, he arrived at the hospital. The waiting room was brightly lit, but it carried the heavy air of anxiety, filled with the soft murmurs of worried families and the beeping of distant machines. He spotted Sophie sitting in one of the chairs, her rabbit in her lap. Her small frame looked even smaller under the harsh fluorescent lights. He walked over and sat down next to her. She didn't look at him immediately, just kept staring at the rabbit in her hands. "They said she's sleeping," she whispered. "They don't know when she'll wake up." Leo nodded, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to comforting people. He dealt in numbers, logic, and control. This was completely out of his element. Sophie finally turned her head to look at him, studying him with those unsettlingly familiar blue eyes. "Why did you help us?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. He should have had a simple answer, because it was the right thing to do, because he had been the closest person around, because walking away wasn't an option when a child was involved. But none of those reasons felt entirely true. "I don't know," he admitted. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. "Do you know my mom?" she asked next. Leo opened his mouth, about to say no, but then something in his mind clicked. A memory, buried deep, trying to surface. A name, a face, a past he hadn't thought about in years. He turned his gaze toward the closed hospital doors where the doctors were treating Sophie's mother. And suddenly, he wasn't so sure of his answer anymore. Leo sat in the hospital waiting room, his mind a tangled mess of thoughts. He had spent years building a life of certainty, of calculated risks and strategic decisions, but nothing about this situation was predictable. He had come to this hotel to escape, if only for a few days, from the constant pressure of running a billion-dollar empire. And now, somehow, he found himself sitting beside a 6-year-old girl with eyes so eerily familiar that they made his stomach tighten. Sophie hadn't said much since they had arrived. She sat in the chair next to him, hugging her stuffed rabbit to her chest, her small fingers gripping its worn ears. Every now and then, she would steal a glance at him, as if trying to piece together why he was still here, why he hadn't simply left like any other stranger would have. Leo wasn't sure why either. A nurse finally emerged from the restricted area, her expression neutral but professional. She approached them, clipboard in hand. "Are you family?" she asked, looking at Leo. He hesitated. The answer was supposed to be no. He had no connection to this woman. Or at least, that was what he had thought. But now, with the weight of the little girl's eyes on him, with the sharp pull of something deep inside his chest, he wasn't sure of anything. He stopped himself. What was he even about to say? The nurse shifted her gaze to Sophie. "Your mom is stable, sweetheart. She's resting now, but she's very weak. We're going to keep her under observation for the next 24 hours. Sophie nodded but didn't say anything. She only clutched her rabbit tighter. Leo cleared his throat. "Can we see her?" The nurse hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "She's still unconscious, but you can sit with her." She gestured for them to follow. Leo placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, guiding her gently as they walked through the brightly lit corridor. The steady beeping of heart monitors filled the air, mingling with the muffled conversations of doctors and nurses moving between patients. They stopped at a small hospital room where a woman lay motionless on the bed. Her dark hair was fanned out on the pillow, her skin pale, her lips slightly parted as she breathed shallowly. Tubes ran from her arm, connected to an IV drip, and the faintest trace of dark circles shadowed her closed eyes. Sophie let go of Leo's hand and ran straight to the bedside. She placed her rabbit beside her mother's arm, as if that alone could bring her back. Leo stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat as he got a better look at the woman's face. Recognition hit him like a tidal wave. Emily. His mind reeled backward, pulling him into memories he had buried years ago. He remembered her. The soft laughter, the sharp wit, the way she used to challenge him in ways no one else ever dared to. He remembered the summer they spent together, the way she had looked at him like he was more than just the ruthless businessman the world saw. He remembered the fight, the heated argument that had ended everything. He remembered walking away. And now, she was lying in a hospital bed, barely holding on. Leo exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. His body tensed with the realization that made his pulse hammer against his ribs. Sophie wasn't just any child. She was his child. The blue eyes. The dark curls. The way she had unknowingly drawn him in, her presence pulling at something deep in his core. It all made sense now, but the weight of it was suffocating. Emily had never told him. She had kept this from him for 6 years. His hands curled into fists at his sides as he stared at the fragile woman in the bed, the mother of his child, the child he hadn't even known existed. Sophie turned to him then, her expression unreadable. "Did you know my mom before?" she asked softly. Leo's throat felt tight, the words catching before he could speak them. "Yes," he admitted, his voice quieter than he had expected. Sophie studied him for a long moment. Then she did something that completely shattered him. She reached out and took his hand in hers. It was small, warm, trusting. Leo swallowed hard, squeezing her fingers gently in return. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that no one could shake him. But in the span of one evening, a little girl with blue eyes had managed to break through every wall he had ever built. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what came next. Leo sat in the hospital chair, staring at Emily's unconscious face. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him like an anchor, and for the first time in years, he felt completely unprepared for what came next. His life had always been about control, about knowing every move before it happened, about being the one who dictated outcomes. But this was something he hadn't seen coming. Sophie sat beside him, still holding his hand, her small fingers curled around his much larger ones. She had no idea what he had just realized, no idea that the man she had randomly approached for help at the pool wasn't just a stranger. He was her father. Leo tried to process it, tried to wrap his mind around the fact that he had a daughter, that for 6 years, a piece of him had existed in the world without his knowledge. And Emily, she had kept this from him. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't demand answers from an unconscious woman, and he couldn't take out his frustration in front of Sophie. The little girl had already been through enough. "Does your mom talk about your dad?" he asked, keeping his voice as steady as possible. Sophie looked up at him with those striking blue eyes that now felt like a mirror of his own. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the rabbit in her lap. "No," she said quietly. "I used to ask when I was little, but she always changed the subject." Leo's chest ached at that. Had Emily resented him so much that she had erased him from their daughter's life completely? Or had she thought she was protecting Sophie from something? From him? He forced himself to take a slow breath. Getting angry wouldn't help anything. The only thing that mattered now was making sure Emily recovered, and making sure Sophie didn't feel alone in the process. "You said you used to ask," he said, watching her carefully. "Do you still wonder?" Sophie nodded, hugging the rabbit tighter. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I used to make up stories about him. That maybe he was a pilot or a secret agent. That he had to go away on a mission but one day he'd come back." Leo felt something inside him crack. He had spent his entire life thinking he was too selfish, too ruthless, too focused on his ambitions to ever be a father. And yet, here was this little girl, his little girl, who had spent years hoping for a man she had never even met. Before he could respond, a soft groan came from the hospital bed. Sophie immediately turned, her face lighting up with relief. "Mom," she gasped, scrambling closer. Leo stood slowly, his body tensing as Emily's eyelids fluttered. She looked exhausted, her skin still pale, her movements sluggish as she tried to lift her head. Her eyes landed on Sophie first. She gave a weak smile and reached out, brushing her fingers over her daughter's cheek. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Sophie let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a sob. "I was so scared, Mommy." Emily's eyes softened, and she glanced around, as if only now realizing where she was. Then, her gaze moved past Sophie and landed on Leo. The second their eyes met, everything in the room shifted. A flicker of shock passed through her expression before something more complicated settled there. She blinked, as if convincing herself she wasn't seeing things, and then her body stiffened. Leo felt the tension instantly, but he didn't move. He just held her gaze, waiting for her to say something. Emily swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here?" Leo crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Sophie found me," he said simply. "She asked me for help." Emily's eyes widened slightly, then flickered to Sophie, who was still clinging to the rabbit. She went to you." Emily's voice trembled slightly, and Leo didn't miss the unspoken meaning behind her words. Sophie had gone to him. Out of all the people in that hotel, she had chosen him. Emily's face paled even more as she seemed to realize something. Her lips parted slightly, and her fingers gripped the blanket covering her. Leo gave her a long, steady look before finally speaking the words that had been burning inside him since he first saw Sophie's eyes. "I know," he said quietly. "I know she's mine." Emily's breath hitched, her entire body going still. Silence filled the hospital room, heavy and suffocating. Leo had spent his entire life making powerful men uncomfortable, forcing them into corners with nothing but his presence. But this wasn't a negotiation or a business deal. This was something far more personal. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know if he had the upper hand. Emily lay frozen in the hospital bed, her breathing shallow as Leo's words settled in the air between them. Her fingers gripped the blanket tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. The beeping of the monitors filled the silence, but all Leo could focus on was the way her expression shifted, shock, hesitation, something close to fear. She had known this moment would come. That much was obvious. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. But there was no denying it now. Leo had spent his life in control of every situation, but for once, he had no idea what Emily would say next. Sophie sat beside her mother, watching the exchange carefully. She might have been young, but she was smart. Leo could tell she felt the weight of whatever was happening between them. Her small fingers clutched her stuffed rabbit as she shifted her gaze between them, confusion flickering across her face. Finally, Emily exhaled shakily, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you find out?" Leo narrowed his eyes slightly. "She has my eyes," he said simply. "The second I saw her, I knew something was off. But I didn't confirm it until I ran a DNA test." Emily flinched at that, her body tensing. "You did a test?" Leo didn't look away. "You didn't give me a choice." Her lips parted slightly, but she had no argument. They both knew she had kept the truth from him, and now there was no undoing it. A long silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Leo could feel the frustration building inside him, the questions he had been trying to push back now demanding answers. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, his voice low, controlled. Emily looked away, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her hospital gown. "Because you made it clear you didn't want a family," she said quietly. "When I told you I was pregnant all those years ago, you acted like it was impossible, like it couldn't be real. You walked away, Leo." His jaw tightened. He remembered that night too well. They had fought, the argument escalating to the point of no return. He had been so consumed with his career, with his ambition, that the idea of a child had seemed like a disruption, something he hadn't planned for, something he hadn't wanted to believe. But that was 6 years ago. And now, everything was different. "You should have given me the chance to step up," he said, his voice sharp but not unkind. "You don't get to decide that for me." Emily let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "And what would you have done, Leo? Back then? You were so focused on your business, on proving yourself to the world. Do you really think you would have dropped everything to be a father?" Leo didn't answer right away. Because, deep down, he knew she was right. The man he had been back then wouldn't have been ready. He had been too cold, too selfish. But he wasn't that man anymore. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice softer this time. "But you never gave me the chance to try." Emily looked at him then, her expression unreadable. There was hurt in her eyes, but there was something else, too, something almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe him. Sophie shifted beside her mother, still hugging her rabbit. "Mommy?" she asked quietly, her voice cutting through the tension. Emily immediately softened, reaching out to tuck a curl behind her daughter's ear. "Yes, sweetheart." Sophie looked between them, then at Leo. "Is he my daddy?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that it hit Leo harder than he expected. He had spent years believing he wasn't built for family, that fatherhood wasn't something that fit into his life. But now, Staring into the eyes of the little girl who had unknowingly changed everything, he realized how wrong he had been. Emily hesitated, her fingers brushing against Sophie's as she sighed. Then, finally, she nodded. "Yes, baby," she said softly. "He's your dad." Sophie blinked, as if trying to process the words. Then she looked at Leo again, her expression thoughtful. "Are you gonna stay?" she asked. Leo felt something shift inside him, something unfamiliar but undeniable. He had spent years chasing success, power, control. But in that moment, none of it mattered. There was only one answer he could give. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." Emily's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but she didn't argue. She just looked down at Sophie, stroking her hair gently. Leo didn't know what the future looked like, but one thing was clear. For the first time in his life, he had something, someone worth fighting for. And he wasn't going to walk away again. Leo had always been a man who made decisions quickly and decisively. In business, there was no room for hesitation. He thrived on control, on knowing the next move before anyone else did. But as he sat in the hospital room, watching Emily's hesitant expression and the way Sophie looked at him with cautious curiosity, he realized this was the one situation where control didn't belong to him. Sophie had just learned the truth, and now she sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her small fingers tracing the seams of her stuffed rabbit. She didn't seem upset, just thoughtful, as if she were processing what it meant to have a father she had never known before. Emily, however, looked anything but calm. She was sitting up now, her back against the pillow, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the blanket draped over her legs. She kept glancing at Leo, and he could see the storm of emotions behind her eyes, uncertainty, guilt, maybe even regret. "You say you're staying," she finally said, her voice quieter than before. "But what does that even mean, Leo? You can't just walk in and expect everything to be fine." Leo met her gaze evenly. "I don't expect that," he said. "But I'm not leaving, either." Emily let out a soft, humorless laugh. "And what? You think you can just become her dad overnight?" Leo exhaled, forcing himself to remain calm. He understood why she was defensive. He had been absent from Sophie's life for 6 years, not by choice, but because of choices Emily had made for him. Now, he was here, and he wasn't going to let anyone, not even Emily, push him away. "I don't expect Sophie to trust me right away," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I don't expect you to either. But I'm not going to disappear just because this is complicated." Emily studied him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether he truly meant what he was saying. Sophie looked between them, then tilted her head slightly. "What happens now?" she asked. It was such a simple question, but neither of them had an easy answer. Leo leaned forward slightly, keeping his gaze on his daughter. "Now, we take things one step at a time," he said. "I get to know you. You get to know me. And we figure it out together." Sophie considered this, then looked up at her mother. "Is that okay, Mommy?" Emily hesitated before letting out a slow sigh. "If that's what you want, sweetheart," she said softly. Sophie nodded once, then looked back at Leo with an expression that was difficult to read. "Are you rich?" she asked suddenly. Leo blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected shift in conversation. Emily let out a surprised laugh, shaking her head. "Sophie," she said, amused despite the tension in the room. "What?" Sophie shrugged. "I just want to know." Leo smirked slightly. "Yeah," he admitted. "I am." Sophie considered this for a second, then nodded. "Okay." Emily rubbed a hand over her face. "That's it? That's your big question?" Sophie looked at her mother seriously. "If he's my dad, I need to know if he's good at stuff." Leo chuckled, unable to help himself. "I'd like to think I'm good at some things." Sophie seemed satisfied with that, then went back to hugging her rabbit. Emily sighed again, but this time it wasn't frustration, it was exhaustion. She leaned back against the pillow, closing her eyes for a moment. "I can't believe this is happening," she muttered. Leo studied her carefully. She looked pale, weaker than he liked. He didn't know how much she had been struggling before tonight, but he had a feeling it was more than she let on. "You should rest," he said. "I'll stay with Sophie." Emily opened her eyes, immediately looking wary. "Leo." He shook his head. "I'm not going to take her anywhere. I just want to be here." Emily stared at him for a moment, then finally, reluctantly, nodded. Sophie crawled up beside her mother, still holding her rabbit, and rested her head against Emily's arm. Within minutes, she was asleep. Leo sat back in the chair, watching them quietly. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about business or deals or power. He was thinking about them. And for the first time, he realized just how much he had to lose. Leo didn't leave the hospital that night. He stayed in the uncomfortable chair beside Emily's bed, watching as Sophie curled up next to her mother, her small hand still gripping the stuffed rabbit. Every now and then, Emily would stir, shifting slightly, but she never pushed Sophie away. The room was quiet, the only sounds coming from the steady beeping of the monitors and the occasional footsteps of nurses passing by in the hallway. Leo wasn't used to this kind of stillness. His world was made up of ringing phones, urgent emails, high-stakes meetings, and constant motion. But here, in this small hospital room, everything felt different. Slower. More real. He found himself studying Emily, the way her face softened in sleep, the way the lines of exhaustion on her forehead seemed deeper than they should have been. How long had she been carrying everything on her own? How many nights had she stayed awake, worrying about money, about Sophie, about how to give her daughter the life she deserved? The realization hit him with more force than he expected. While he had spent the last 6 years consumed by work, by profits and power, Emily had been raising their daughter alone. And she hadn't once come to him for help. Not for money. Not for support. Nothing. That truth didn't sit well with him. As the first hints of morning light began filtering through the blinds, Sophie stirred, her small body stretching before her blue eyes blinked open. She looked around, momentarily confused, before she spotted Leo sitting across from her. For a second, she just watched him, as if trying to decide whether or not he was really still there. Then, she sat up slightly and rubbed her eyes. "You stayed," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. Leo nodded. "I told you I would." She didn't say anything right away, just hugged her rabbit a little closer before looking at her mother, who was still asleep. Then, to Leo's surprise, she slid off the bed and walked over to him, standing just a few inches away. "Are you really my dad?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Leo looked down at her, at the dark curls that framed her face, at the striking blue eyes that mirrored his own. It was still strange, still something he was trying to process, but the answer was the easiest thing in the world. "Yes," he said. "I am." Sophie studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide if she believed him. Then, without warning, she reached out and touched the sleeve of his suit jacket, her small fingers brushing against the fabric. "You feel real," she said. Leo let out a quiet laugh, though there was something tight in his chest. "I am real," he promised. Sophie considered that, then nodded. "Okay." And just like that, it was as if something shifted between them. She didn't ask him any more questions, didn't press him for explanations he wasn't sure he even had yet. Instead, she simply climbed into the chair beside him, curling up with her rabbit in her lap. Leo sat there, staring at her, still trying to wrap his mind around the fact that this little girl was his daughter. He had spent so many years thinking he wasn't made for family, that he wasn't the kind of man who could ever be a father. But here she was. And for some reason, she didn't seem afraid of him. She trusted him. Emily stirred then, her eyelashes fluttering as she woke. The moment she opened her eyes, her gaze went straight to Sophie. A flicker of panic crossed her face for half a second before she realized her daughter was safe, sitting beside Leo. Her expression shifted into something more guarded. "You're still here." Leo met her gaze, unbothered by the skepticism in her voice. "I told you I'm not going anywhere." Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. She still looked tired, but there was something else there now, something hesitant. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice quiet. "I don't know how to let you be a part of her life." Leo leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then we figure it out," he said. "Together." Emily looked away for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the hospital blanket. "She doesn't even know you," she said. "She's only just met you." Leo nodded. "I know. But she came to me first, Emily. She trusted me before she even knew who I was. That has to mean something." Emily let out a slow breath, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I kept her from you," she admitted. "And I don't regret that, because back then, I didn't think you wanted to be a father. But now," she trailed off, her gaze flickering toward Sophie. Leo could see the struggle on her face, the fear of letting him in, the fear of what it might mean for Sophie. But he also saw something else, reluctant hope. He had spent years building walls around himself, convincing himself that relationships were distractions, that love was a weakness. But as he sat in that hospital room, watching his daughter quietly trust him in a way he didn't deserve, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong all along. And for the first time in his life, Leo Kingston wanted something more than just success. He wanted to be a father. The morning sunlight cast a soft glow through the hospital room's window, illuminating the quiet scene inside. Emily sat upright in the hospital bed, her fingers absent-mindedly smoothing over the blanket as she watched Sophie, who was still curled up beside Leo in the chair. The little girl had fallen back asleep, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. Leo hadn't moved. He simply sat there, his posture relaxed, but his mind was anything but. His entire world had shifted in a matter of hours, and now he was left with a reality he had never even considered before. He had a daughter. A 6-year-old child who had spent her life believing her father was nothing more than a distant question, a mystery her mother never answered. Emily exhaled, drawing his attention back to her. He could see the hesitation in her expression, the uncertainty that hadn't left since she first realized he knew the truth. He understood it. She had raised Sophie alone, made every decision for her, and now, without warning, she had to figure out how to make space for him in a life he should have been part of all along. "I don't know how this is going to work," Emily admitted, her voice quiet, careful. "She's never had a father, Leo. She's never even asked for one since she was little." Leo studied her for a long moment before answering. "That doesn't mean she doesn't need one." Emily flinched slightly, as if his words struck something inside her, but she didn't argue. She glanced at Sophie, her face softening as she reached out to brush a stray curl away from her daughter's cheek. "I'm scared," she confessed. "Not just for her, but for me too." Leo leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "I get that," he said, his voice calmer than he felt. "But I need you to understand something, Emily. I'm not walking away from this. I missed 6 years of her life. I'm not missing another second." Emily looked at him then, really looked at him, as if searching for cracks in his determination. But there were none. He wasn't saying it just to say it. He meant every single word. After a long silence, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Okay," she said finally. "We take this slow. We figure it out as we go." Leo nodded, relief washing over him. "That's all I'm asking." Emily's lips pressed together, and she exhaled again, as if forcing herself to release years of fear and doubt. "She likes chocolate chip pancakes," she said after a moment. "It's the only breakfast she'll eat without complaining." Leo's eyebrows lifted slightly at the sudden change in conversation, but then he realized what she was doing. She was giving him something small, but important. A glimpse into their daughter's life. "Chocolate chip pancakes," he repeated, committing it to memory. Emily hesitated again, then continued. "She hates the sound of thunder. She always sleeps with that rabbit, even though it's old and falling apart. She loves coloring, but only with markers because she thinks crayons break too easily. And she hums when she concentrates, even though she doesn't realize she's doing it." Leo's chest tightened as he listened. Each detail felt like a window into the life he had missed, a life he should have been part of. "She's going to have questions," Emily said, her voice softer now. "She's going to want to know why you weren't there before." Leo's jaw tensed, because that was the one question he wasn't sure how to answer. How did he explain to a 6-year-old that he had been too blind to see the truth? That he had walked away from something he hadn't even known was real? "I'll tell her the truth," he said finally. "That I didn't know. That if I had, I never would have left." Emily held his gaze, searching for any sign of dishonesty. But there was none. After a long pause, she nodded. "Okay." Leo sat back, feeling something settle inside him. He had no idea what the future held, no idea how long it would take for Sophie to truly see him as her father. But he would wait. He would prove himself every single day, not just to her, but to Emily as well. Because for the first time in his life, he had something worth fighting for. And he wasn't going to lose it. This story is about more than just a billionaire discovering he has a daughter. It's about redemption, responsibility, and the unexpected ways life forces us to face the choices we once ran from. Leo Kingston starts as a man who believes he controls everything, his business, his reputation, his emotions. But finding Sophie shatters that illusion. She represents something he never accounted for, the chance to be part of something bigger than himself. The moment he realizes she's his daughter, his entire world shifts. Power and wealth no longer define him, fatherhood does. Emily, too, is a complex character. She's not just a woman who kept a secret, she's someone who made a difficult decision based on who Leo was at the time. She protected her daughter the only way she knew how. Her hesitance to let him in isn't just about anger, it's about fear. She's afraid of what letting him into Sophie's life might mean, afraid that he'll leave, that he'll break Sophie's heart the way he once broke hers. But the true heart of this story is Sophie. She's the one who instinctively reaches out to Leo before she even knows who he is. She is trusting, resilient, and full of innocent hope. And in the end, she's the reason both Leo and Emily take a chance on something uncertain. The final moments of the story aren't about a perfect, happy ending. Instead, they show the beginning of something real. Leo can't erase the past, but he can change the future. Emily can't undo her choices, but she can allow herself to believe that people can change. And Sophie, she gets what she's always quietly longed for, a father who chooses her. The beauty of this story lies in its imperfection. It's about learning to build something new from the wreckage of past mistakes. It's about forgiveness, second chances, and the realization that sometimes, the most unexpected people can change our lives forever.